Hey folks, so today we're going to be looking at titles in detail in DaVinci Resolve version 16. What we're going to be looking at today is we're going to take one of those defaults and we're going to go into Fusion and we're going to go into the node editor and we're going to pull things apart and we're going to look at the anatomy of how these titles are created. We won't be creating our own custom title. That'll come in another video, but we're really going to fully understand at the end of this video how the default titles that you see over in this left pane are constructed. So let's just take a look at a very simple one. I want to keep things simple for this video because there's quite a bit to cover and it'll be easy to get lost in the weeds if we take too detailed an example. So let's pick lower third simple underline. So I'm going to click on this, I'm going to drag it down to our timeline and let go. And I'm going to play this one real quick just to give everyone a sense. So if you keep your eyes up on the viewer here, spacebar to play, super fancy title comes up with that green bar underneath. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the elements here that we're going to be looking at. So very first, we see this green bar animation that comes up. And then the second element is the text that appears. Then we just sit here for a while, and towards the end, we reverse that. So it's very straightforward, but there's quite a bit that goes into it, even just to get this simple animation here. So let's head over to Fusion and we'll start to deconstruct things. So you can click down here on your title, click on Fusion, and what we see at the bottom here is our node editor. Now, I'm going to assume zero experience with Fusion, so we're going to take things pretty slowly. Fusion is a huge module in and of itself. Just to give you a little demonstration, if I just right click here and I go add tool, just the sheer number of options here is very overwhelming. We're going to keep things pretty simple today. So if you've never used Fusion before, you still should be able to follow along. So one of the things that I can do first just to get things set up is I can just right click here, I can go scale, and I can go scale to fit. That's just going to bring my nodes into the middle here. Now before we start talking about these nodes down here, I want to take a look up at this timeline here. But first what we're going to do, you'll notice there's a 2-up display here. One display over to the left, one display over to the right. I'm just going to come up here, I'm going to click this button here to change into a single viewer because we're just going to be needing to focus on the single viewer for this tutorial. Now I want you to take a look down here at this timeline here. This timeline is set up in frames. So these numbers that you see here is the number of the frame. So if I take my playhead, drag it to the back, I press spacebar, again, we can focus just on our animation here and not have to worry about a bunch of other elements. This thing's going to repeat, or it's going to loop because this button here is on. Spacebar to stop. Now you'll notice this goes up to about 150 frames or so. What that has to do with is, if I go back to the cut page for example, this clip is 5 seconds long. So 5 times 30 frames per second. If I go back into Fusion, that's where I get this 150 frames from. So of the two nodes that we see here, it's the one on the left that we're most interested in, but very quickly, the one on the right, everything we do in Fusion is going to have one of these media outs, and essentially what the media out represents is whatever it is that we're working on. So in this case here, this here is essentially our media out. This is what's going to be shown back in the cut page and the edit page when we integrate this single Fusion element into our greater project. But in any case, we don't want to worry about this. I'm just going to move this over to the right here. Now, if you look very closely here, this called lower third simple underline is actually not a single node. If you look at the top, it looks like it's a bunch of nodes stacked on top of each other. So what that means is we can double click on this and we can open up this editor here. I'm going to resize this box to give us a little bit of extra room. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rearrange some of these nodes in here that'll make it a little bit clearer in terms of the different sections that we want to work on to get this super fancy title animation. So first there's the keyframe stretcher. We're going to ignore this for now, but it's a pretty cool tool and I'm going to talk about that towards the end of the video. This node here called output, that's essentially a merge node, which is going to merge this top section here, which is text, the super fancy title, and it's going to merge that with these 3 nodes here, which represent this green bar and the animation associated with that. So I'm going to move this merge node over here. I'm going to select all these guys and I'm going to move them down here. So again, these nodes here represent the text. These nodes down here represent the green bar. What I'm going to do, I'm going to move this media out up a little bit. What I'm going to do is I'm going to slowly recreate this, all these nodes over in this space here. And as we do them one by one, it's going to be pretty clear what each of them do and how they all fit together. So the very first node that we want to look at is this line color node here. So this line color node represents this green bar here. Now you may think that this green bar actually exists, the dimensions of this green bar, but in truth what's actually happening is this entire background is green and there's a mask that fits over this rectangle here. And I'm going to show you how all that fits together. But at the very first, what we need to do is we need to create a background with a simple color. And to do that, we come over to this node here. This here, all these tools up in this toolbar here are different nodes that we can create. And again, if I go back to add tool, these are all the nodes that are available to us. So the ones shown in this toolbar are really just the ones that we're going to use most frequently. So I'm going to take this background node, I'm going to drag it over here. I'm going to take the background color and I'm going to change it to red. Now you notice nothing happens up in our viewer, and that's because our node isn't connected to media out. What I'm going to do temporarily is I'm going to click on this line in between, and I'm going to take this background node and I'm going to drag it over here, and I'm going to release it in the middle of this media out. So now our background node is connected to our media out, and this background node, all it is doing is displaying whatever color we have set up here. So this background 1 node, what I'm going to do is I'm going to rename it, and I'm going to rename it similar to the line color that you'll see over here, because that's sort of the same node in this case. So I'm going to right click on this, I'm going to go down to rename, I'm going to call it line color 2. One thing to notice is whenever you hover over one of these nodes, it's going to show you a bunch of information. It's going to show you line color 2, and then underneath that in parentheses you see background. That's the type of node that it is. So if you're ever in question, so I'll come up to this main text, for example, and I see that's a text plus node. If I come over here, I see that this node here is another rectangle node. I come down to the output here, I see it's a merge node. So now that I have this full background color, what I want to do is I want to create a mask essentially, and that mask is going to be in the shape of the green underline effectively. So to do that, I'm going to come up to this rectangle node here, and I'm going to drag this down here. And you'll see this rectangle control come up here. And again, this rectangle node is not connected to anything just yet, so it's not going to actually do anything. But in any case, what we can do is we can come up to these arrows here. I can click on this vertical arrow here to move in the y-axis, this here to move in the x-axis. I can click the little square in the middle to move it both at once. I have my rotate here, just going to do an undo there, or I can drag and I can resize, or I can drag the corners as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a bar similar to what we see before. Now you'll notice right now the whole screen is red, but what's going to happen as soon as I hook up this node to this node, there we go. Now we see something similar to that green bar that we saw before. Now it's important to recall that since I disconnected this node section over here from our media out, it's only these two nodes that are displaying up here. So this here is really doing nothing right now. I'm going to rename this rectangle here. This rectangle here actually corresponds to this line rect over here. This here is responsible for the animation when that bar slides in. We're going to get to that in a minute, but right now I'm going to come in here. I'm going to press F2 as a shortcut. Line rect 2. Now before we go any further, I want to talk a bit about masks, because that can be a bit of a tricky concept. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these nodes, I'm just going to put them down below. I'm going to temporarily delete this from the media out by clicking on it. And I'm going to add a background node and 2 rectangles essentially. This one's called rectangle 1, so I'll put that one over here, rectangle 2. This background node, we'll put red again. I'm going to connect all these together in a chain. So if I click on this first rectangle here, I'm going to move this up to the top left. I'm going to click on this rectangle here, and I'm going to move it down a bit. Notice these two are overlapping. So essentially both of these rectangles represent masks. And probably the most important control inside mask to worry about right now is this level control. This can be from 0, meaning completely transparent, all the way up to 1. And that value becomes very important when you start to combine how these two masks are going to work together. So there's something very interesting. If you notice how these are hooked up. So rectangle 1 is hooked up as an input into rectangle 2. So if you take a look up at the controls over here, I'm now focused on rectangle 1. So the controls up here. Keep your eyes up here as I select rectangle 2. Here we go. If you notice, this paint mode is an extra control that wasn't a part of rectangle 1. And the reason that showed up is because the software is smart enough to know that this mask here has another mask as its input. So if I click back on rectangle 2, this paint mode control here is going to specify how these two masks interact together. So let's go through an example to show how those two are going to work. So first I'm going to come back to rectangle 1. I'm going to come up to our level. I'm going to change that to 0.5. And I'm also going to come into rectangle 2 and I'm going to change that as well to 0.5. So right now those are at 50% opacity, but now we're going to start to play with this paint mode and it's going to merge those two together in a different way. So the default is merge, and that essentially just brings the two masks together. That's not really what we want to do though. So if I come over to this drop down here, let's take for example this add. So what add is going to do is whenever these two masks intersect, it's going to take the level value and it's going to add them together. So we know each mask has a level of 0.5. So in this intersection here, 0.5 plus 0.5 is 1. So this section in here is going to be full red, 100% opacity, whereas all the other portions are just going to remain as they are. So let's do that here, add, boom. So that's how the add control works. So now let's take a look at subtract. I'm just going to go back to merge now just to reset the masks here. So with subtract, what it's going to do is it's going to subtract the value of the second mask from the first mask. So this first mask here, its value is set to 0.5. This is also set to 0.5. So under this intersection, the math is going to be 0.5 minus 0.5 or 0 for this intersected part. So this intersection here should look like what you see up here, and then the rest of this is kind of ignored because it's this value that's being subtracted from this value here, the first node. So we're going to set that up as a subtract, and there we go. We see it kind of cut out that piece of the puzzle there. Now if I take this subtraction, we can kind of start, and I'm just going to play with the size a little bit here, we can kind of get a sense of how this animation might start to work. Some of you might be thinking, okay, how do we keyframe this so we can do that animation? I'm going to show you how to do that. In truth though, this animation isn't set up using the subtract, it's actually set up using this minimum. And the minimum kind of works like this. So how minimum works, it's going to take the minimum value. And again, when I say value, we're talking about the value set in levels here. It's going to take the minimum value between those two. So if I come and I start to see an intersection, so remember there's a mask over here and there's also this mask over here. Where those intersect, the minimum value is actually 0.5 for those. So that's where you start to see this show up here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to crank those back up to 1 for the rectangle 2. And you'll notice that didn't change anything because the minimum value on that intersection is still the 0.5 from the first mask. So I go back to this rectangle over here, which is set at 0.5, and I'm going to crank that up to 1. So now the minimum value on that intersection between those two is 1, and that's why it shows up as full red. So there's a number of other modes. We're not going to look into those because this minimum is the one that we want to use. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to just get rid of all these nodes here, because it's back to these nodes here that we care about. So let's hook up our line again, and there we go. So we're going to add some space in between here because what we're going to want to add now is another rectangle mask that is going to perform our animation for us. We're going to take this, we're going to set this to minimum because that's the one that we wanted to use, and we can kind of see, oh yeah, here we go. This is how it's gonna this is gonna work. It doesn't really matter that this is a whole lot higher. As long as it covers it, it's gonna work fine. So there's a couple of ways we can do this. If we drag this control over here, now remember, this one that I have highlighted here, this is the second rectangle here. And let's rename this just to be consistent. So line rect anim. Okay. How are we really going to set up this animation here? If I set up this second rectangle mask over here to the left, and I push this over to the right, well, yeah, that gives us what we want. That's that reveal, and then at the end of the animation, I could pull it back here. That would mimic what's happening here with this green line. And to do that, I would simply keyframe this value here. Hey guys, I just want to take a little interlude here to explain the very basics of how keyframes work in Fusion, because it can make what we're trying to do with the titles a little bit easier to understand. So first thing what we're going to do is we're going to come to Effects Library, we're going to come down here to Effects, and we're going to click on Fusion Composition. So what Fusion Composition is, we're just going to drag that down to our timeline. This is basically an empty blank slate for anything we want to create in Fusion. So we're going to click on this to highlight, we're going to move over to Fusion. And you'll see in our node editor, there's nothing except for a media out. So I'm going to change up here just to a one-up display. I'm going to grab just a text plus node and I'm going to bring it down here. We can't see anything yet in our viewer because we haven't connected things up yet. Just very briefly, if we wanted to go back to the two-up display, these two little nodes down here, if we click on the first one, that's saying display this node up in here. Notice there's nothing showing right yet because we don't have any text. So I'm just going to type sample in here. Oops. And then we see it display there. You'll notice that this media out is set up on the second node here, which is the second screen here, but we can't see anything yet, and that's simply because we haven't connected things. Once we connect, boom, off we go. So for now, I'm going to just turn that one off. I'm just going to go back to single up display. Now what we're going to be doing with the text when we get our title set up is we want to basically do some animations in the x-axis by sweeping this text back and forth. So what we're going to do to look at that is we come over to the layout, and then our x and y coordinates are going to be set up here, center x and center y. So just in terms of how this coordinate system works in DaVinci Resolve, if you look, first of all, if you look down here, when I move my mouse up over the viewer, as you can see the coordinates, the x and y. The way the coordinate system is set up is down at the bottom left is 0, 0, and in the top right is represented by 1, 1. So right now, our x and our y is set up at 0.5, which means we're directly in the middle of the screen. So I'm going to change these now to 0.1 and 0.1. So that's going to put us somewhere down here. 0.1, 0.1. So there we go. So this is where we're going to start our animation. Now one of the things we want to look at is the Spline Editor here. There's nothing in the Spline Editor because we don't have any animations or keyframes set up yet. But this is going to be pretty important in terms of giving us a very good visual representation of what's happening with all these animations that we're doing on screen. So I'm going to ignore the X and Y position for a minute because I just want to drive a point home. We're just going to look at the size parameter for a second. So size starts off at 1, and as we bring this down, it shrinks down to nothing, to 0. So size, the size control is bounded from 0 to 1. It has to be those values here. So if we start off at 1, I'm going to go to to frame 10, and I'm going to set up a keyframe. So I'm going to come up to size, I'm going to click on here. So as soon as I click that, you'll notice this line shows up here in our Spline Editor. And the way this works is across this top axis here, this is the number of frames. So 0 up to, we're about 120 frames for this particular clip. On this axis here, it's the value of size. So we're set up here, and as we run along, what this is basically saying is this size parameter is going to be set to 1 throughout the duration of all these frames here. And that's what it does. Nothing actually changes. So I want to set up another frame. I'm going to move about 20 frames forward to frame 30. And here I'm going to take that size and I'm going to bring it down to 0. So it completely disappears. Now you can click this zoom to fit button here, because things have gone off the screen. So this will sort of snap things into place. Perfect. So we can select this node down here, and we see that its value shows up here. Now I said earlier the size is bounded between 0 and 1. Well, it is on the slider, but you can actually put a value larger in here. So I'm going to put 5, and then our text goes 5 times as large as it was by default. That's not really what I want though, so I'm just going to come back down to here, and I'm going to set it to 0.5. So what I like about this here is that the values that you see here on this y-axis are the exact values that you would see in here on a particular frame. Notice that says 0.55 now. That's just because I moved off our frame. So the reason I looked at size is to show that when we want to move things in the x and y directions, things are a little bit different. So I'm going to right click on this. I'm going to go remove text one size. That's essentially the path that I just created. So I've gotten rid of any keyframes. Now let's take a look at setting up X and Y. So we're starting here. We're starting at 0, 1 and 0, 1. So I'm going to go back down to frame 10. I'm going to set a keyframe there. And then I'm going to come up to frame 30. And I'm going to move this to 0.2 and 0.2. So that's going to come up somewhere around here. There we go. Here's what's very different about how X and Y coordinates work. If you take a look at our editor now, our Spline Editor now, the new values, if you look at the values, the first node is not the 0.1, 0.1, which we originally had set. It's set here to 0. And when we look up here, this top node is set to 1. That's because if you look over here, we're working in this displacement mode. We're not working with individual X and Y coordinates, which is what we're going to switch to after. But in the meantime, let me just explain how this displacement works here. So displacement, think about displacement in terms of how far off your original point you are. So if we look at this node here and we say that's our home base, so to speak, at the start of our animation, that's represented by a 0. We haven't gone anywhere yet. When we move to this next node, we come up to this value of 1. Now displacement is always going to be capped at 1, meaning we've gone the full distance of our trip here. So what's going to happen is when I put another point up here, 0.2, 0.2, let's do that and we'll see what happens. So I'm going to go up to frame, I'll go to frame 50 there. Then here we're going to go, or sorry, 0.3, 0.3. So now if you look what happened here, our new node is set to 1. So meaning this node here represents the furthest distance we've gone from our origin. The second node here, this was 1 before, it's now been set to 0.5, meaning this second keyframe here, I keep calling them nodes keyframes, the second keyframe here is actually halfway through the total distance that we're sort of traveling here. So if I run that animation, all that's happening is we're sort of sliding up the, Hey guys, I'm back. I'm running a GTX 770 circa 2014. It's pretty flaky when it comes to keyframes, so I have quite a few crashes when it comes to keyframing. So if you guys have issues like that, throw some comments below. Let's commiserate and try to get through it. Okay, so in any case, here we are. We've set up our two keyframes to sort of traverse this up a little bit this way. I want to just extend things a little bit further. I'm going to go out to to frame 60, and I'm just going to pull this up over here somewhere, and I'm going to zoom to fit, and then we see that next point is still capped at 1, and because we went a pretty long distance there, you see these other two shrink down to smaller values. Now one thing to notice is if I go up to let's say frame 70, even when I pull backwards here, since we're heading back towards the origin, you might think that this value would kind of come up as we go further away from the origin and then come back down again. Let's take a look what actually happens in truth though. So I'm going to bring this one back down to here. And what happened is that last keyframe that we created is still set up to 1, and that's really, I mean, think about it, sort of your car going to work and back to home again. You end up in the same spot, but you've traversed some distance. So displacement is going to be really measuring that total distance. Now, when it comes to what we want to do, I don't really like working in this displacement mode. I want to work in terms of actual X, Y values that I can see. For me, I want to see the numbers here that represent the actual values that I set up in the controls here, and not a normalized displacement number that we're sort of working with here. So we can actually do that. We can set things up. So how we're going to do that is we're going to come up on, so I right click on center, and what I want to do is I want to come down to this modify width, and everything here you see is grayed out. And it's grayed out because I have an existing set of keyframes already set up here. So I can't change things now, it's kind of too late. What I want to do is set up to this XY path. So I'm going to come over to here and I'm going to right click on this and I'm going to remove path 1. So I'm going to get rid of all my keyframes. Now I'm going to come click on center here. I'm going to go modify width, and now I can select all these options here. I want to click XY path. Now if you take a look down at our spline editor, no longer do we see that displacement single value that was representing both the X and Y coordinates in one. We see them broken up separately. So now when we start to keyframe the X and the Y separately, you'll notice right now that these values here, so this red here is our X, so 0.533 so-and-so, so that's about here, 0.53, and then we're at about 0.31 for our Y coordinate. So when we move up further to here, well, let's say on 70, I'm going to set a keyframe there. Then we're going to come up 10 frames, and I'm just going to grab this here, and we're just going to move it over in both directions here. And now we can see we have control over these X and Y coordinates independently. We'll go forward with using this one. So let's head back into our old example and we'll get back to it. Okay, so now back to the example that we have set up. So recall over on the left-hand side, we have our grouped example that we're trying to reproduce. And then over on the right-hand side is the nodes that we're adding to reproduce that same effect. So one neat little feature here is, even though all these nodes are grouped, down at this bottom of this container here, there's this, the viewer node shows up as well. I can select the left or the right viewer. So I'm going to select left for this. I'm going to come up to here. I'm going to select dual viewer. And now we can see this here shows up on the left, and our stuff over here shows up on the right because of our media out is set to viewer 2. So this is a handy way of reverse engineering what we see over here and reproducing it over here. So before we get our animation set up over here, let's take a look at the keyframes and how they do things here. So what we know is that there's two elements that are animated in this title here. So if we go back and scroll, there's the text, as we see, go up and down, and then there's also the bar. And we know that the bar animation is this one here. As we can see, as we scrub our slider with that selected, we can see what that's doing. So that's a rectangle mask that starts off with a width of 0, and then the width increases over time. So that's how they do it. There's a couple different ways we can do it, but that's how they've chose to implement this one. Also, our main text mask up here, this here is the mask that hides our text. So it's the main text that's actually animated. So if I highlight main text, as we move the scrubber along, that text is moving up, and it's moving out from behind that mask. So the mask here, if you notice, the top of that mask comes right up to sort of the middle of this green bar. So when we look at our text here and we scrub around, we can see it gives the illusion that it sort of pops up from behind that bar. Now if we want to look at this in a little bit more detail, let's go into our spline editor here, and we are going to select this animation down here. And we can see over here in our spline tree, we have this control here, line rect anim, and we have the width parameter here that's being swept. So this width parameter here with this yellowish color here, well, we can see what's happening over the entire set of frames here. So essentially we start back here with our width. Let's go back to frame 0. This is actually going back to negative frames. So I set on frame 0 here. So the width of this animation mask here is set to 0. As we come up to frame 20 here, we can see this mask expand, and we see it expand up to a value of 0.8 something. So that's the value that we've set now. We can see from frames 20 over to frames roughly, looks like frame 139, that bar is going to stay there, and then we can see it's going to start to drop off as well. There we go, and then it disappears. So one thing to notice is these the segments that join these two keyframe nodes here, it's not a straight line, it's a smooth line. We're going to come back to that after, and we're going to play around with that a little bit. So that's how the bar animation works. In terms of the text animation, let's go back to frame 0. Remember, our mask is sitting here. This is our text mask. If I move this out of the way and I play this a little bit, you can see our text start to come up. So our text is hiding down there somewhere, and we can see it sort of pop up. but we don't want it to show below the bar. That's the purpose of this mask here. It's going to come into here, and then we can see the text jump up from behind, essentially. So the mask here isn't doing any of the animations, whereas it is when we're dealing with the bar. Instead, here we have the text that's doing an animation. It's doing an animation in terms of its position. So let's click on main text and we'll see that. And if we look here, we see main text, center, displacement. So this one is using the displacement that we had looked at from before. So we click on displacement. So we see this purplish spline here. I'm going to turn off the other animation just to clean up our interface a little bit. Now you'll notice here that displacement, again, we cap up at value of 1. Somehow this one drops down to 0. I haven't figured this one out quite yet. When I was explaining a few minutes before, each time you add another keyframe, the new keyframe ends up getting set to 1 and all the other keyframes kind of drop down. That actually made a lot of sense to me in terms of how displacement should work. I'm not sure why this one's coming back down to 0. If you have some more information on that, let me know in the comments and I'll certainly appreciate that. In any case, if we go back to frame 0 and we scrub up, we can see here our text starts to move upwards. There we can see it appear now. And then at frame 32, we're just going to hold off until frame 134, it looks like, and then it's going to disappear again. So that's essentially how the animations work. So pretty straightforward. We're going to reproduce that now on our side here. Okay, so things are going to get a little bit crowded here. I want to keep the Spline Editor open so we can see that. I'm going to move this over, so we're just going to focus on our piece of the puzzle here, but I am going to keep this other display up, so as we scrub the slider, we will be able to see our source animation. Okay, so let's get going. So right here, we've discussed that it's this one here that we want to animate to be able to make our bar appear. So pretty straightforward. What we're going to do is I'm going to turn on this. So recall all these controls right now, they're under this lower third simple underline. That lower third simple underline is actually the name of this container here. So everything you see nested under this tree here refers to what you see here. As we add keyframes on our nodes over here, you're going to see more stuff pop up here. So we'll keep these two on, and again, this yellow one here is for the bar animation, this purple one here is for the text animation. So okay, let's rock and roll here. So we click on this guy here, and we see it about frame 20 right here. That's when the bar is out full, so that is where we are going to set our first keyframe. So I'm going to right click on this, as we discussed before, modify with. I'm going to go on X path. I'm not going to use displacement, I'm going to use the X and Y coordinates. So I click on X and Y, there we go, we see X and Y show up here. We're only dealing with X, so I'm going to turn off Y for now, just so we don't clutter up our interface. So right now we're set at around 0.5 somewhere. It's actually 0.528, as we can see here. So that's where we're going to be set up for our frame 20. When we go back to frame 0, we want that bar to start off sort of disappeared here, right? So we're going to go back to frame 0, and I'm going to pull this back here, and I'm going to release. There's nothing else that I have to do for those that are new to keyframing. All I have to do is move this control here, and it will automatically set a keyframe on whatever frame that I'm set on, as long as I've set one previous keyframe. So when I right-clicked on center and I said change to XY path, that set up automatically for me a keyframe on frame 20. And so whenever I move to a different frame and I move this control around, effectively moving the X and the Y coordinates around, a new keyframe is automatically going to be generated. Okay, so we got our keyframes over here all set up. And what I've done is you notice the way this interface works here. So I have these 3 splines showing. Each of these can be in sort of 3 modes. They can have a checkbox, which means they're on and editable. If I click it one more time, they turn to these little circles here, and that means it's still showing, but I can't edit it, which is pretty handy. And if I click it one more time, they're completely off. So I'm going to set these 2 up here to still show. Actually, you know what? Since we're doing the bar animation, I'm going to turn off this spline, or this purple spline here, which represents the text animation. So I'm going to turn that off completely. I'll keep this one here because this is the one we're trying to mimic, and this is our active bar that we're animating right now. So one of the things that you'll notice here is I'm going to just zoom back a little bit here. Is if you look at this brown spline here, if you look at the transition, it's a smooth transition, whereas ours is just this linear transition here. So how this linear transition here is going to work, think, back to my car analogy of this is a car going from not moving at all to full speed and then just coming to a dead stop again. So that kind of behavior doesn't really happen too much in the natural world, and things look kind of robotic when we have this linear transition between two different points here. So we want to sort of smooth things out like we see here. So we can do that in a number of ways. So right here, if I just select this node here, you'll see this little spline handle come up here. So I can grab that and I can sort of drag it around, and I can end up smoothing things out. And depending on how I stretch this, I can smooth things out how I want. So I just want to basically set a nice, easy transition into this sort of steady state that we see up here. I can do the same thing with this node down here. I'll pull this down here. So now we're not going to start abruptly like it was here. We're going to start kind of slowly, speed up through the transition and slow down as we come into steady state here. Now, a couple different ways I can do that. I'm going to highlight these. Again, I'm just going to right click on this, brings up this menu here, and I'm going to put linear. That brings it back to what we had before. I'll keep those selected. I'm going to right click, and I'm going to instead press flat. Now flat, it's kind of an unfortunate term because flat sort of might imply what we see here. But flat is not referring to this transition. It's actually referring to this spline handle here. It's going to flatten this spline handle out. Let me show you. Click on this, right click, and flat. So now these two spline handles have been set horizontally, which gives a nice, easy, smooth transition. So we're going to stick with that. That looks pretty good. Now we want to go to the other side of our animation here, and we want to reproduce the same thing. So right now, if I were to scrub through this here, as we scrub from frame 0 to frame 20, we can see that bar appear. So that looks good. And as we come over to here, so this is about frame 139, that's where we want to keyframe our bar again. So I'm going to select our animation here, which represents the animation for this mask. I'm going to come up to here. I'm going to keyframe that. So we see that keyframe has been created. That's good. And I'm going to now go to the end. Frame 149 is our final frame. And again, I'm going to pull this down to 0 here. So same issue, we have this linear transition. So I'm going to highlight those, and I'm just going to press F for flat. And we get that nice organic transition that we see here. So that all looks well and good. So let's pull this slider back to the start here, and I'm just going to slowly scrub through this animation here. You know what I'm going to do just to clean up the interface here? I'm going to just unselect. I'm just going to click on this gray, so that just kind of cleans things up here. And I'll run this. So there's our bars up here. And the bar disappears. So what you'll notice here is my interface is really quite slow right now in response to the scrubbing. I'm not getting very smooth animations here. It's working, but it doesn't look super fluid. And if I were to come back here and I'm going to press play, you'll notice things are really having a rough time. So the reason is because I was having crash after crash after crash, and I couldn't really get anything to work properly without crashing every few minutes when it comes to keyframing. So what I did, if you guys are having the same problem, one not ideal workaround, but certainly a workaround, is come up to DaVinci Resolve, into Preferences, and under System, under Memory and GPU, I'm using this is version 16.2 that I'm using. I set my GPU processing mode to OpenCL. So this is not really taking advantage of my graphics card, which is I think contributing to this slow performance that you see, but it's not crashing. So I'll take it for now, and I'll have to fix that other issue sometime in the future. So that looks pretty good. We have our bar animations working, so now we're going to add in our text. So to do that, just for now, I'm going to close the spline, bring things back over to here, and we're going to drag in a text plus control. That's the same as this main text here. I'm going to drag in a rectangle control, or node, sorry, which is this to represent this one here. And I'm also going to bring in this merge node here. So this merge node is right here. So I'm going to bring in this merge node. I have to break that link. Our media out's going to be up here. I'm going to hook the merge node out to the media out. I'm going to hook this So our mask is going to be feeding our text, and then down here we're going to be setting up line color into our merge node. So basically that's merging our text with our bar animations in this merge node and piping to media out. Okay, there we go. So I've just renamed these controls here just to make everything consistent. So everything here is, you'll notice I've appended with a to suffix. Okay, so this is looking pretty close. So the only thing we're missing right now is this keyframe stretcher, but we're gonna get to that in a moment. So let's just take a look now at our text controls. So first, our text is not showing anything right now. So we're gonna put super fancy title. There we go. And we're just going to drag that down to our starting point. We want this to start behind the line. And remember, this mask here is going to fit over. But now let's take a look how this mask is working by default right now. So this mask is covering this rectangle here. When I grab the mask and when I head away from this super fancy title, well, that's when it actually hides it. So we want to invert this mask basically. So I'm going to bring this mask down here, and we'll just set it up. We'll get it roughly in line. I can come over here, I can press invert, and now that's hiding everything that's inside this rectangle instead of anything that's outside of that. So that's looking pretty good. So now we want to go over to our main text here, and I'm going to move this over here. We're going to open up our Spline Editor, and we're going to do the same thing with main text here. So I'm going to turn off all the bar animations. I'm going to turn on this displacement. That was the main text animation here. And we're going to do the same thing. So we're going to come back to frame 0 for main text. That's where we want to be. We want to be hidden here. I'm going to keyframe the Y position in this case. So first we're going to do our little trick here where we right click on this, modify with XY path. X and Y both show up. I want to deal with just Y in this case. So we're keyframed at frame 0, and then we're going to move up to this frame here. Oops. This looks to be frame 32. 32 is where we want our text to be fully shown. So we want to move up to about here. So that looks good. So that's going to be at keyframe or at key 32. So then we move over again to this keyframe here, 134. We're going to set our keyframe manually there. And then we come back to, looks like we come back down 144. That's when we shrink back down to nothingness. So there we go. Our keyframes are all set up. We're going to use the same trick as before. Oh, one thing I do notice, I didn't start on this keyframe, or I started this keyframe here on 0, but really we want to move this out a little bit to here. So one thing I can do, I'm just going to undo here, made a mess of that, is I can click on this node here, and I want to move it out to around this frame here. So I'm going to shift, hold down shift as I select this, and that's going to constrain my movement to only the x-axis. So I'll bring that out roughly to that frame there. That looks pretty good. And again, I'm going to grab all these nodes now, and I'm going to push F, which is going to smooth them out a little bit. So that's looking pretty good right there. So we come back to frame 0. So we come back to frame 0. I'm just going to drag this along very slowly. We see the bar come up. Frame 20, the bar is fully up. We see the text start to come up. All good. We go into this kind of steady state mode until we get to the higher frames, and then our text starts to recede and our bar starts to pull back, and we're back down to nothing. So there we go. We've recreated that animation. The only thing we're missing now is this keyframe stretcher. Now I did mention earlier that I wanted to cover the key stretcher. As I'm playing around with that though, I'm realizing I really don't understand that quite as much as I want to, and I'd prefer not to give out any misinformation. If the key stretcher is something you're interested in, please let me know in the comments, and I'll make sure to do a dedicated short video on that. It's a very undocumented feature, and I think it's not fully understood by the community. So thanks for toughing it out. I know that was a bit of a long one. We covered a lot of ground though, and I think we all now have a pretty good understanding of how titles are created. So if you found something interesting or useful in here, please consider subscribing. Any comments as well, please put them below, both positive and negative. I'm certainly always open to feedback. Thank you very much, guys, and we'll talk soon. Bye.